Hey there, welcome back. It's James here, and in this video we're going to move on from comments and we're going to start talking about the basic building blocks of coding, and that's something called variables. So if you've ever taken any type of high school math course, maybe some basic algebra, I'm sure you've heard about variables in the past. They're simply a storage unit, if you will, that stores some type of value. So for example, I'm going to delete all this code. In algebra, you may see something like x equals 5, and you'd have a problem that said something like 5 plus x, and then you were expected to give the answer to that. Of course, 5 plus x would be 10, and that's how variables work in basic algebra. Variables work exactly the same way with computer programming, right? We take a variable and we use that to store some type of value, and there are different types of values that we can store, and we'll get into those in future videos. But right now, I want you to understand the very, very basics. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start writing some code, and then I'll break down and explain exactly what the code is doing. So the first thing I'm going to do is say name equals James. And this is a variable. Name is a variable, and it's storing the value James. So now, if I wanted to print James, there's two ways I could do it. I could just hard code it, or I type print James, and every single time I run that program, it's going to say James, James, James. But that's not very useful, right? Not very useful at all. What if we wanted to print the name that somebody actually entered, right? So in that case, we might do something like print name, and whatever is stored in this variable is what it's going to print. So if I run it, it prints James. If this was something different, like say Tim, and I run it, it's going to print 10. If I change it to Tina, for example, it's going to print Tina, and so on and so forth, because this variable is simply storing whatever value we assign it, and then we can call that variable later in our code, and it's going to give us that value. If I change this from Tina to a number, obviously 5 doesn't make much sense for a name, but when we run that program, it will print 5 because that is what has been assigned to that particular name variable. For the most part, when it comes to Python programming, we don't really have a limit on the amount of variables we can use. Obviously, computers have different memory, and depending on that memory, there's a real world limit. I mean, we would eventually run out of memory, but that aside, there's no rule in Python that says you can only have X number of variables. So for example, I may have several variables. I may have color 1 equals blue, color 2 equals red, color 3 equals green, so on and so forth. And then I could do something like print color 1 plus color 2 plus color 3. And when I print this, we're going to see blue, red, green. Now there's no spaces because we didn't have spaces in our variables. It just took these 3 variables and it mashed them together. But again, the main thing to remember with variables is they're simply a storage unit. We're storing some type of value in that variable, and then we're able to call those variables later in our code and retrieve those stored values. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this video up there. Again, in future videos, I am going to dive deeper into variables. We're going to talk about different data types that can be stored in those variables and some different ways those variables can be used. If you like this video, be sure and give it a thumbs up. Make sure to subscribe to the channel. And if you have any questions or comments, make sure and leave those below.